Hello, students. Guess who's been to Jamaica, man? Greetings, students. How y'all doing? Give me a second. Let me pull up our lecture for tonight, and we will get started here in just a moment. So we are at week number 7. The Jamaica shirt is compliments of study abroad trip that we did in January. So I think there might be a few of you in class who actually went on that trip, but if you didn't, you missed a great time. Tonight, we're going to talk about Eurocentrism, language bias, environmental racism. We're going to do a little bit of time talking about ideology as well as cycles of oppression. So bear with me. We're going to try to cover quite a bit of material tonight, given this is our next to our last week of class. So I just wanted to tie some things together. And again, as we had talked about earlier, that the class would not be absolutely covering all forms of privilege and oppression, but some of the ones that we see more frequently. So that's really kind of the task for today. So without any further ado, let's get started. So we're going to start off with this definition of Eurocentrism. And basically, this is the practice of viewing the world from the European perspective, or there's this implied belief that European culture is the superior preeminent culture. So now, why might that be important? It's important because it really shapes and frames a lot of the things that we see happening, a lot of decisions that are made at the policy as well as individual level as we make decisions about various things in our country. So an example that comes to mind for me is that there are 7 continents. There are literally hundreds of countries with millions of people all over the world. And if we were to honestly pay attention to, for example, what's covered in the news, we do a world perspective on things that are happening in the news. Often when there are sources of trouble or tension or chaos or disaster or things of that particular nature. But very seldom do we spend a lot of time looking at, for example, news from other parts of the world that just really look at what's happening in their part of the world. So when you think about and you watch the news, I want you just to pay attention to what's the main focus. And you can often see that there's a very Eurocentric view to it. One of the things that I see quite a bit, and this is just kind of my own personal piece or thing that I see, is, for example, we spend a lot of time in the United States media covering things like the royal family. And that is, considered to be a part of Europe. But, there are a lot of things that are happening in the world, say, for example, in South America or other continents that don't get nearly the exposure. So again, just this whole notion of Eurocentrism is something to be aware of as you move into your practice in terms of a way of looking at the world through a European perspective, and thinking that is the superior way to move. Let's talk a little bit about ideology, political, economic control, and powerlessness. So now, as we've been talking for the last several weeks, we understand this whole concept of ideology, and that's about how people believe and think and subsequently act and then behave in the world. And so when we think about institutions and who runs the institutions, we think about conscious experiences that actually end up subordinating people. So let's think about what a concept of family looks like. Now, we know that in our practice that families look different based on where they are, but mainstream definition of society would be one that's viewed more in terms of what the dominant culture looks like. As it relates to education, media, and religion, these are also institutions that shape our view and shape how we see other people and shape how we determine what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So what we're taught and what we're not taught, and what we hear and see through the media, what we learn at church, are all things that really have an impact in terms of our own ideology, our own thinking about the world, our place in it, and how we then should subsequently connect with other human beings there. when we take it a step further and we think about privileged groups, when we think about folks who have means and access to resources, money, wealth, political power, by and large, they tend to be white. And so when we start to think about how procedures and policies are put into place, and we start to look at some of the outcomes, then it's no surprise that a lot of things that we find ourselves grappling with today are things that have been put into place by those who have been in power. So, political positions that determine what laws get made, who can be a citizen, how much taxes you and I pay. And we also have the ability to influence our military, which actually has the ability to actually enforce our beliefs for our constituents around the world. If we see it a certain way, then we have the ability to use force and violence to actually get things done. When we also look at the political systems, we also think about elected officials, think about presidents and Congress members, the senators and judge, who all determine, what penalties for breaking the law are, who goes to jail, who does not. All of those particular things are set up again by, when you think about the ideology, you think about who has access, and you think about the privileged communities that are by and large white, then we see that a lot of the systems or the situations that we find ourselves in struggling with as a country are really put into place by those folks that we elect into office. And we all know to be elected, for example, to a national office or even to a state office, that means that you're going to have to spend awesome sums of money. You and I don't have a lot of money. So if we decide to run for office, we'd actually have to find people who believe in our vision, who would actually then bankroll what we would need to have ads and to run a campaign and all those particular things. So we're talking about tens of thousands of, and for national elections, sometimes millions and millions of dollars. And so as you think about that, if I then decide to run for United States Senator representing Minnesota, and I get backers, then I'm going to have to also have wealthy people who are going to have to be able to do campaign contributions to help manage the campaign. At the end of that campaign, if I am successful and I'm elected to office, I have a debt of gratitude that I owe to those people who actually finance my campaign. So it might be more so that I might be more inclined to look at legislation that might be more favorable towards my constituents or the folks who help get me elected. And thus you have just kind of a microcosm of what the actual political system looks like. So now, when we go further and we start to look at, when we talk about dominant group membership, folks who have the power, folks who have the finance, folks who have the means and the ability and the influence, by and large, they're Christian, wealthy, white, heterosexual, able-bodied males. So we just need to understand that dynamic. I think about the signing of the Constitution and thinking about who was in the room at that particular point in time, as well as who was not in that room. And so the very basis for how our country was started really kind of lended itself towards this particular group. So what does that mean for everybody else? It means that, you are at a disadvantage in terms of having your decisions or having things that are going to impact your well-being to actually be taken seriously and to be dealt with. So again, we need to think about the ideology. And so as we looked at all these different forms of privilege and oppression, we see that the backdrop to this process is what we have here when we're talking about these ideological controls. So when you got politics, then follows economics, follows education, media, X, Y, and Z. So again, when we think about the state of our economy now, when we have the 1% who own 90 some odd percent of the wealth in this country, then that shows this whole lopsided distribution or economic distribution where it's controlled by a handful of people. So things we just need to think about as we're kind of exploring this class and looking at why we come to be in the places that we are, and what we're going to have to do differently to actually get ourselves out of this. So now this next slide is really interesting in that what we have here is really the cycle of how oppression tends to work. So you have a target group and you have a non-target group. So when we think about things like people discriminating against folks who are not heterosexual or who are transgender, People who are discriminating against folks because of race or different race or ethnicity. When we have situations where folks are discriminated against because they happen to be a woman. And the list just kind of goes on and on. They can be disabled, they can be elderly, they can be English learning language, they can be any number of different things. But this is how the cycle actually tends itself to work. So you can plug into the non-target group anywhere above that line in terms of that continuum where I shared with you this diagram of the axis of privilege early on in the beginning of the class. And you can insert folks who are above the line in terms of privilege into the non-target group. And you have this cycle where there's a systematic mistreatment of that target group. It generates misinformation and ignorance about the group. So it perpetrates things that may be true, may not be true. These things become socially sanctioned through attitudes, beliefs, feelings, and assumptions, which justifies further mistreatment. And the target group, then usually the folks who are being oppressed, are the victims of that. So, you know, if we wanted to do an example, I'll try to think of one very quickly. So if we have target group being men, and then or should I say non-target group being men and the target group being women, then we know that we have a country that has a history of treating women as though they were second-class citizens. And they justify this by the use of various religious institutions, by sheer physical size in terms of the differences throughout history. You know, women have been seen as property. So if that type of mentality then continues to perpetuate itself in, like, I don't know, 2019, then you can see that the non-target group of men continues to justify the mistreatment of women based on all the things that they do. So when we think about things like wage inequality, or when we look at the number of women who are actually running major corporations or who are leading states, who are elected to office in the national level, you'll see that there's a disparity in terms of that. And that's not by happenstance, that's in some ways by design. It's men who are the target group who continue to perpetuate this cycle. So now, then you get target group resistance. So women fighting back. They get isolated from the non-target group because, you know, men here, women there. Sometimes that information gets internalized and there's this misinformation and people react either to prove it true or untrue, and it becomes further justification. So if we look at this cycle, you can take any of the forms of oppression that we have talked about. You can pit a privileged group versus a non-privileged group or an oppressed group, and this is how it continues to get perpetuated. So it's important for us to understand that, because if we're going to ever look at being in a place where we try to resolve some of those issues or end some of the oppression as it is, we need to be aware of how the cycle actually works at the micro, meso, as well as macro level. So keep that in mind. That's a very important piece. Let's talk about language bias for a moment. So when we talk about language bias, we're basically looking at, because you can actually you can put the word bias language in front of it and have a whole different meaning. But basically, when we're looking at situations where there's this preference that's given to the English language, especially when compared to other languages, and we see it a lot of times, more so in our educational settings, especially in K through 12. Where students are starting to learn. And we are improving, I would say, overall as an educational entity across the country, but there's still a long way to go. And there are still issues around language bias. And there's a short video clip that you have actually should have watched for tonight, or that we'll be watching later on, that gives you an example of some teachers who are English language learners who talked about their struggles. And many of them are in the educational field now, trying to eliminate that barrier for other kids that are coming along. So again, language bias is an issue that we need to be aware of and how we play into that. When we look at the other side of that, then we also can recognize that even inside of this English language, that we can further perpetuate discrimination in all these areas: age, race, gender, disability, sexual orientation. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what that could actually look like. So, for example, referring to folks as minorities. You're a member of a minority group. You're the minorities here, the minorities there. That's code language. A better use of non-biased language in this instance would be people of color, because when we talk about minorities, it basically kind of continues the whole norm of white domination, and that is kind of the norm. And so when we use that, we trigger those kinds of situations to be around. Also, given the status of immigration in our country, it's better to refer to folks as being undocumented instead of illegals. What is illegal? Illegal has a negative connotation to it, and it's a loaded, biased type of language. Another example might be sexual orientation, which is the preferred use instead of sexual preference, because sexual orientation means that people were born this way. Sexual preference tends to say that it's a choice that you're making to be that way. So again, we need to be very careful about language and language bias and how it plays out, even in terms of the work that we do. I know the NASW has a guide that talks about unbiased language. Even when you guys are writing papers, APA style, there are some things that you have to be aware of in terms of how you actually move pieces across as well too. So moving on to our next area, and we talk about environmental racism. And so I'll give you a second just to kind of read the definition here and just to think about that for just a moment. All right, time's up. So when we talk about environmental racism, we're basically looking at where toxic environment wastes from factories that produce goods and power plants, things of that particular nature, that are just kind of put into the atmosphere. And what we have found out, or what research is showing, is that in most instances, poor communities of color are where we see some of the largest atrocities in terms of things happening to people. And again, things are done as a result of policy, and we know what the ideology is around how policy gets made. So it's no incident or no coincidence that things kind of play out the way that they do. It often results in lower quality of life and increased health concerns for folks who are living in proximity to those particular environments that pollute our surroundings. So here are a few examples of, and some are actually fairly recent, of examples of environmental racism. So all of us have heard things about the water crisis in Flint. So there's the decisions made about the types of pipes that ended up actually for years having water flowing through to homes that was really not even safe for bathing or for human consumption. And so we realize now in some further investigation that that happened as a result of a policy being made about using substandard materials because it'd be cheaper for the city. And when you think about who lives in the city, working class, largely poor folks, and a large number of people of color. We think about Chester, Pennsylvania. It's the site of the 7th largest garbage incinerator in the entire country. About 42,000 people live downwind. It's a suburb of Philadelphia. And again, poor community with people of color that are residing there who are having numerous health concerns as a result of the toxic air that they're breathing. Standard Oil out in Richmond, California, same scenario. And interesting when I found also pig farms in North Carolina, where they have these massive pig farms, all of us who love bacon and ham. Other people are paying the price for some of that in terms of the waste and the runoff from those particular farms are actually finding their way into the topsoil as well as into the water table and contaminating drinking water, resulting in increased health concerns for people who live in that area, as well as, by again, largely poor people who are working class, who are communities of color, again, are the victims of this particular type of racism. And then polluted air, pollutes air in LA. So when we think about the polluted air in the Los Angeles area, for example, and we all know about the smog and the emission standards that are California specific to try to reduce some of that. But even in the midst of that, when we look at LA and we start to look at neighborhoods where concentration of pollution tends to be even higher, 71% of those neighborhoods are populated by communities of color, where 31% of the white communities may live there, but by and large, they live in areas where the air is much cleaner to breathe. So some examples for you of environmental racism and how it actually plays itself out. So we talked about Eurocentrism, the view of America through the lens of European being the predominant and the preeminent way of looking at things. We talked a little bit about the ideology in terms of politics and economics. And we understand that whole decision-making process and who runs things. And if we're going to change things, we need to take a look at those seriously. We ran through the oppression cycle, which talks about how you can fit any target group into either of those particular categories and see the system and how it continues to perpetuate the oppression that we experience. We talked a little bit about language bias, as well as understanding biased language in terms of how we write things, how we say things, how we utilize English language. And then we also talked about environmental racism as well. So we have talked about those things. And so I wanted to just have that conversation with you as we prepare for class. So again, I would encourage you to do your readings, to take a look at the video clips, and to understand and see how these particular concepts play a very important role in helping us determine the type of work that we're going to do as we're social workers in the field. So again, thank you for your time and attention. See you soon.